The first thing I felt was the weight of the blanket pulling unevenly on my legs, like someone had just stepped away from the bed. I opened my eyes a little, letting the dim hospital light sharpen into shape. The room was too still for that hour, and the air carried that dry, metallic smell that settles in when the night staff change shifts. My chest rose slow, tight, and something in me knew I wasn't alone. A shadow moved near the foot of my bed, calm but intentional. The soft squeak of rubber soles came closer. When I turned my head, a nurse leaned over me, her face half lit by the monitor glow. Her voice dropped to a whisper so thin it felt stitched into the air. "He thinks you won't wake up again." The words were flat, not dramatic, not emotional, just a fact she needed me to hear. Her eyes flicked toward the IV pole with a quickness that didn't match her steady hands. I followed that look. The bag hanging beside me wasn't the one I'd seen earlier. The color of the fluid had a cloudy tint that didn't belong in anything meant for a hospital line. I'd spent my life around machinery and tools. You learn to notice when something isn't standard. This wasn't standard. My mouth felt dry as I swallowed, and the slight burn in my throat made the back of my neck tighten. She straightened as another pair of footsteps passed the door. Her posture shifted instantly into a routine calm, checking my pulse as if she had said nothing at all. The door window caught a sliver of movement, someone from staff walking by, and she kept her face steady, her hands gentle and measured. Only when the hallway grew quiet again did her fingers pause just enough for me to feel it. Her voice didn't rise this time. She just pressed my wrist once, firm, a silent warning to stay alert. I must have looked older than my 76 years lying there, half slumped in the bed with the stiffness in my joints refusing to ease. My body had been weak for weeks, but this was different. This felt like the kind of weakness that doesn't come from illness alone. I kept my breathing even, trying not to show how sharply my thoughts were moving. The nurse glanced again at the IV pole, as if measuring time or risk. Her eyes shifted to the hallway once more, then back to me. She didn't speak again. She didn't need to. There was a tightness in her jaw that told me anyone could walk in, and she would step back into routine without a trace of concern. She adjusted the blanket, smoothed the corner near my arm, and with that same controlled movement, brushed her fingers lightly against the line connected to the bag. It was as close to pointing as she could safely manage. I let my eyes lower halfway, pretending to be more tired than I was. From this angle, the bag's label caught the faintest line of light. It looked printed over something else, like an old sticker had been peeled and replaced. It wasn't a detail you notice unless you're trying to see it. But now that I couldn't unsee it. A cold heaviness settled at the base of my spine. She stepped away from the bed slowly, giving me a look that lasted less than a second, but carried more weight than anything I'd heard from the doctors. Then she disappeared into the hallway, her footsteps fading into the overnight hum of machines and distant murmurs. I lay still and let my breathing match the soft rhythm of someone half asleep. The room felt different now, quiet in a way that hid movement instead of revealing it. I kept my eyes closed just enough to watch the shadows shift across the floor. Every sound in the corridor sharpened against the silence. I listened for footsteps, not the nurse's, someone else's, someone waiting for me to drift off again. The room felt colder in the early light, the kind of cold that sinks into the ribs and makes every breath feel slower. I lay there trying to piece together how I had ended up this weak, this dependent, and this unsure of the people closest to me. The silence in the room gave me too much space to think, and those thoughts came heavier than I expected. After my wife passed, the house changed in ways I didn't know how to manage. The routines we built over decades vanished, and I filled the hours with small tasks just to make the rooms feel lived in. Age wasn't kind, and the aches that used to fade by afternoon stayed with me through the night. I tried to handle things alone, but some nights, even getting out of the chair felt like lifting a weight I wasn't prepared for. My son stepped in more after the funeral. At first, it felt like help. He handled the mail, made calls I didn't have the energy to make, and kept track of appointments when my memory started slipping around the edges. I told myself it was natural, the way families shift when life forces them to. He said he wanted to make things easier, and I believed him because believing anything else required a kind of courage I didn't have at the time. But there were moments, small ones, that stayed in the corners of my mind. Times when he answered questions for me before I finished them, or when he signed paperwork with a confidence that didn't leave room for me to read it first. He would steer conversations away from things he didn't want to explain, and I let it pass because arguing took more strength than agreeing. I didn't think much of it back then. I didn't think I needed to. He took over the medications after I mixed up the nighttime pills twice. He brought a plastic organizer and filled it without asking which ones made me dizzy or which ones the doctor said to take with food. When I hesitated, he told me he would keep track so I didn't have to. His voice always carried that tone, steady, firm, a little too practiced. I accepted it because it was easier than admitting my own decline. Earlier in the day, before the shift changed, a different nurse had come in to check my pressure. She asked simple questions, the kind meant to sound casual. Who brings your medicines? Who manages your chart? Who makes your decisions when you're tired? Her eyes stayed soft, but the way she listened wasn't casual at all. I answered honestly because lying to someone who sees patients fall apart for a living doesn't make sense. Still, there was something in her face that didn't settle right with me. Lying in the hospital bed now, those moments lined up in my mind with a clarity I never put together before. Each one seemed harmless alone, but together they formed a pattern I didn't want to recognize. The idea that I may have ignored warning signs because I wanted peace more than truth unsettled something deep in me. There's a particular kind of fear that comes from realizing you might have handed over trust without checking what it cost. The hum of the machines beside me felt louder as the hours dragged on. I shifted slightly, the stiffness in my legs reminding me how quickly my body had changed these past months. I thought about the IV bag from the night before and the nurse who warned me without saying more than a sentence. Fear settled in quiet, not in panic, but in a kind of steady understanding. As the hallway settled into its late-night rhythm, an old conversation surfaced, the one I never thought much about. My son had leaned over me weeks ago when I was half asleep in the recliner. He said, almost under his breath, "Some decisions are easier when someone's sleeping." I remembered brushing it off as clumsy wording. Now it didn't feel clumsy at all. The morning light came in flat and pale, cutting across the floor in a way that made the room feel colder than the night before. I kept my eyes half open, trying to look like I was drifting in and out of sleep. A nurse moved quietly beside the bed, and her hands worked with a pace that didn't match the usual routine. She reached for the IV pole, unhooked the cloudy bag my son had brought the previous day, and replaced it with a clear one from the hospital supply. She didn't speak. She didn't even look at me, but the speed of her movement told me she didn't want to explain what she was doing. When she slid the old bag into a small bin attached to her cart, she angled her body just enough to shield it from the hallway. That alone was enough to tighten a knot in my stomach. I waited until she stepped out before adjusting myself in the bed and pulling the tray closer. My chart sat clipped to a corner, half covered by a folded towel. I lifted it slowly, scanning the lines with the kind of focus that comes when your instincts refuse to calm down. There was a medication listed I didn't recognize. The name was long, something I couldn't pronounce, and written next to it was "family provided." That phrase hit harder than it should have. I traced the line with my finger, reading it twice just to make sure I wasn't imagining it. My body felt heavier the longer I stared at it, as if the paper itself carried a weight I hadn't felt before. The door swung open without warning, and my son walked in with a smile too tight around the edges. He was earlier than he ever bothered to come before. His voice carried that warm concern he used whenever he wanted to control the direction of a conversation. He asked how I slept, if I needed anything, if the staff had been attentive. He asked so many questions that none of mine had room to surface. When a nurse came in to check the monitor, I tried to ask her about the medication on the chart. My son stepped in before the question finished leaving my mouth. He answered for me, saying it was something the doctor had mentioned as optional. The nurse looked at him, and then at me, and then made a small note on her tablet without commenting. I watched the way his hand hovered near the bed rail, close enough to seem protective, but positioned just right to discourage anyone from getting too close. He stayed longer than usual, pacing around the room in small circles. When he finally stepped out to take a call, I adjusted the blanket near my side. A small slip of paper fell out, folded twice. My pulse jumped as I opened it. The handwriting was quick, almost rushed, and the message was only 3 words: "Stay awake tonight." The room felt suddenly tighter, like the air had thickened just enough to make breathing deliberate. Later in the afternoon, a slow dizziness crept over me. It wasn't dramatic, just a soft tilt in the room whenever I shifted. I noticed it only happened after he touched the IV line or the cup of water on the tray. It wasn't enough to panic, but enough that my hands stayed tense on the sheets long after he stepped away. As evening settled in, the hallway lights dimmed and the conversations faded into low murmurs. I shifted slightly, trying to get comfortable, when a sound caught my attention. Through the small window in the door, I saw my son standing close to a doctor. Their heads were bowed, their voices low, and the doctor's jaw clenched in a way I hadn't seen before. My son's hand moved sharply through the air as he spoke, and the doctor's eyes flicked toward my room. Whatever they were saying, they didn't want me to hear it. The next morning, I waited until the room was steady with the usual daytime noise before asking a nurse I hadn't seen before to check my chart. She approached with a polite smile, the kind meant to put patients at ease, and held the clipboard where I could see it. I asked her to read the list of medications aloud, pretending my eyes weren't sharp enough to make out the smaller print. She read each line carefully, her tone steady, until she reached one entry and hesitated. When she said, "family supplied," her expression tightened just enough for me to notice. She didn't comment. She simply cleared her throat and moved to the next line, as if the pause hadn't happened. When she left the room, I kept my gaze fixed on the door until it closed. That phrase sat in my mind longer than anything else she read. The idea of medicine entering my veins without the hospital approving it pressed a pressure behind my ribs that didn't ease with breathing. I needed to understand exactly who had the authority to bring anything into this room, and more importantly, who thought they had the right. In the early afternoon, the midnight nurse came back on duty. She moved differently from the others, not rushed, but deliberate, as if every choice she made had a reason behind it. She adjusted the curtain, straightened the monitors, then shifted to the side of the bed, where the small wall camera couldn't see her face. She kept her voice low and asked if I was feeling stable. Before I could answer, she tapped 2 fingers lightly on the IV pole. The gesture was small, but the meaning was clear. When she leaned closer to adjust the tubing, she whispered that she hadn't approved any outside deliveries. Her tone stayed even, but her eyes told me she wanted me to understand the seriousness of it. I nodded once, slow enough to avoid drawing attention. She stepped back into the visible area with practiced ease and asked a routine question about my comfort. No one watching would have seen anything unusual, but I felt the shift. Someone inside this building understood more than they were allowed to say. When she left the room, I pulled my belongings drawer closer. It wasn't much. My wallet, a folded sweater, a few papers my son had insisted I not worry about. I opened the folder where I kept my medical notes and insurance cards. The top page was gone, the one with the list of previous medications and allergies. It wasn't a document anyone else would have needed. I searched through the rest, flipping slowly, but the missing sheet wasn't tucked anywhere. My chest tightened in a way that had nothing to do with age. Later, one of the attending doctors stepped in to check my vitals. He was the type who measured every word before saying it. As he adjusted the blood pressure cuff, he asked whether my son had discussed any end-of-life preferences with me. The question landed with a quiet force. I told him no, and he gave a small, thoughtful nod, as if confirming something he already suspected. He didn't push further. He simply noted it in my chart and left the room with a heaviness in his walk. The hospital sounds faded into a steady background drone as I lay there thinking through every detail. Each piece on its own could be brushed aside, but together they formed a picture I couldn't ignore. I felt the cold edge of determination settle in. If there was danger here, I needed to see how far my son was willing to go. That night, when the hallway quieted and the lights dimmed, I shifted in the bed and let my breathing grow shallow and unsteady. If he believed I was slipping, I wanted to see how he reacted. The results came back just after sunrise, when the halls were still quiet and the night staff hadn't fully cleared out. A nurse walked in, holding a small printout, her expression controlled but not neutral. She set it on the bedside table without saying anything, then pointed to a line near the bottom. The numbers showed a sedative in my blood, one I had never been prescribed. The room felt heavier as I read it. The dosage wasn't high enough to knock someone out instantly, but high enough to dull awareness and slow reaction. Seeing it in black and white made something cold settle at the base of my spine. Before I could ask questions, the midnight nurse slipped in behind her, carrying a fresh stack of supplies to make the visit look routine. When the first nurse left, she stepped closer and lowered her voice. "Someone had tried to file a DNR under my name," she said, her tone steady but her eyes sharp. It hadn't gone through because the signature didn't match the one on my earlier forms. She didn't accuse anyone directly. She didn't need to. The weight in her voice was enough. She checked the line on my IV, pretending to adjust it. Her hand paused near the connector. If sedatives entered the system slowly, she said quietly, most people would think the decline was natural. The idea hit with a quiet force that made my pulse stumble. The thought of anything being slipped into me without my knowledge tightened every muscle in my chest. Before she could say more, a knock came at the door. She shifted instantly into her professional rhythm, moving to the other side of the bed as hospital security stepped in. The guard asked if I needed anything, his voice polite but distracted. When he thought the nurse wasn't listening, he mentioned that my son had asked about transfer protocols, specifically how quickly a patient could be moved without requiring additional evaluations. He spoke the words casually, but something about his timing suggested he wanted me to hear it. After he left, the room stayed still for a long moment. The nurse gave a small tilt of her head, signaling she understood the weight of what the guard had said. Then she left too, carrying her tray like nothing unusual had happened. Later that afternoon, as I pretended to rest, I heard voices outside the door. I recognized my son's tone immediately. Calm, steady, the way he always sounded when he wanted people to trust him. But this time, there was something colder beneath it. He told someone he won't be aware long enough to fight it. The words came through the thin door quietly, but they carried a certainty that made my stomach tighten. I didn't hear the response, only the soft scrape of their shoes moving down the hall. When I reached for the drawer beside me, the folder containing my legal documents was gone. I checked the back of the drawer, the pocket where I kept smaller papers, even the space under the blanket. Nothing. The spot where it had been felt too empty, like the absence alone carried its own kind of message. A nurse came in shortly after to check my vitals. The cuff tightened around my arm, and she watched the numbers appear on the monitor. She didn't say anything unusual, but as she adjusted the wires, she leaned closer and whispered that certain drugs could make an older patient seem confused, tired, or unsteady. "People think it's the body giving out," she murmured. "They don't always question it." I lay back against the pillow, feeling the weight of every detail pressing inward. The sedative in my blood, the attempted DNR, the questions about transfers, the missing paperwork, the whispered comment outside the door. None of it pointed toward recovery. None of it suggested waiting for me to get stronger. It suggested waiting for me to stop breathing. The hospital lawyer arrived just after noon, carrying a thin folder and a pen clipped to his coat. He pulled a chair close to the bed and opened the file with a steady, deliberate motion. When he laid the copy of the DNR across his knee, the first thing I noticed was the signature. Crooked, rushed, nothing like the one printed on my identification forms. He tapped the corner with the pen and said the writing didn't match, not even slightly. His tone stayed low and even, but there was no hesitation in it. The document looked forged, he said, and whoever submitted it had pushed it through confidently enough to assume no one would check twice. A knock came at the door, and the midnight nurse slipped in to replace a monitor pad. She waited until the lawyer stepped aside, then leaned in, as if adjusting the wires. Her voice dropped just enough for only me to hear. She said she had removed the questionable IV bag the moment she saw it, before anything harmful could run through the line. Her posture never changed, her hands moving with practiced calm, but her words carried a weight that settled deep in my chest. She had acted quickly, and her timing mattered more than I wanted to admit. Later, a security officer came by with a small tablet, showing still images from the hallway camera. The footage wasn't dramatic, but it didn't need to be. It showed my son stepping into the room carrying something tucked under his jacket. In the next frame, his hand reached for the IV pole. The angle didn't catch what he did, but the movement alone answered questions I had been avoiding. The officer didn't offer opinions. He simply showed the images, tapped the screen once, and left the tablet on the tray for the lawyer to review. When the doctor came for rounds, he kept his voice calm, almost too neutral. While checking the monitors, he leaned closer and told me to avoid private conversations with my son. "Anything important should be said where staff could hear it," he said. There was no fear in his expression, only a quiet certainty that made the room feel smaller. He adjusted the cuff on my arm, nodded once, and walked out with the kind of measured stride people use when they're carrying information they can't state openly. The lawyer returned with a stack of new forms, directives that blocked unauthorized individuals from making decisions on my behalf. His tone stayed strictly procedural as he explained each page, but there was an urgency beneath it, a controlled tightness in the way he handed me the pen. My hand shook slightly as I signed, not from age, but from understanding that these papers might be the only barrier between me and the intentions of someone who should have protected me. When the last page was complete, he gathered the documents quickly, as if time itself had become part of the risk. My son arrived not long afterward. The change in his behavior was immediate. He noticed the staff watching him, noticed the lawyer's presence earlier, and his questions came sharper, faster. He wanted to know why certain decisions were being complicated. He wanted to know who had been interfering. He didn't raise his voice, but his jaw clenched in a way I had never seen before. Nurses kept entering the room on small pretexts, adjusting a monitor, checking a chart, picking up a tray, each one staying long enough to make sure he couldn't speak to me without ears nearby. By evening, the hallway outside my door had grown quieter, but the feeling in the room hadn't eased. The lawyer returned once more, closing the door behind him. He reviewed the footage again, then folded the file neatly and slipped it into his briefcase. His voice dropped as he spoke, firm and without hesitation. "You need protection now, not tomorrow." The lawyer returned early the next morning, carrying the same briefcase but with a different weight in his posture. He pulled the chair close again and lowered his voice, outlining how we would handle my son's next visit. He wanted every question answered clearly, every step observed by staff, and every decision kept within documented lines. I nodded, listening to the measured way he organized each point. His calmness didn't ease the pressure in my chest, but it gave me something solid to stand on. The midnight nurse came in a short while later, her eyes sharper than before. She adjusted the curtain, as if checking the light, then mentioned that a security officer would be stationed near the door whenever my son entered. She spoke with the same steady tone she used for blood pressure readings, but her glance toward the hallway carried meaning. She knew things were escalating. She wanted me to feel the support around me, even if she couldn't say it outright. Her presence felt like an anchor in a room that had grown too unpredictable. By early afternoon, word of the new restrictions had clearly reached my son. The moment he walked through the door, the air tightened. He didn't bother with the calm voice he usually used. His questions were sharp, demanding, pushing past politeness. He wanted to know why he needed to sign in twice, why staff hovered near the room, why certain decisions were suddenly out of his control. His eyes darted around the room, as if searching for someone to blame. When the nurse entered to check the monitors, he stepped too close, his body angled in a way that made her pause mid-step. I watched him try to intimidate her without raising his voice. He asked why she kept interrupting and why she needed to verify every small detail. She didn't flinch. She simply noted his behavior on her tablet and stepped out with a professionalism that didn't invite further argument. But his jaw clenched, and he looked at me with a frustration that felt sharper than his words. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said, standing at the foot of my bed. The sentence came out low and controlled, but the threat beneath it was unmistakable. It wasn't anger, it was calculation. He wanted the process to feel burdensome, as if I was the one complicating a simple path he had already chosen. Later, when he left the room to answer a call, the lawyer stepped in again. He opened an evidence folder on the tray beside me. Inside were the sedative reports, time-stamped printouts of the footage showing my son's movements, and documentation of the attempted DNR. He arranged everything with a precision that made the situation feel even more real. The papers weren't dramatic. They were factual, quiet, and heavy enough to change everything. He asked if I understood what each page meant. I nodded once. The truth was already clear. The rest of the day moved slowly, each hour tightening the air in the room. Nurses checked on me more frequently, each one offering subtle reassurances in their routine tasks. The security officer lingered just within sight of the doorway whenever the hallway quieted. Everyone seemed to sense that the next step was approaching, even if no one said it out loud. As evening settled in, the lawyer asked one final question. When my son returned, did I want him confronted immediately, or did I want to speak first? I looked at the folder, the documents, the proof arranged neatly in front of me. I let the answer settle in my mind before speaking. If the truth was going to be revealed, I wanted it spoken clearly, directly, without anyone acting as a shield. I told him that when my son came back, I wanted all staff to step out of the room. I needed to hear the truth from him alone. The room felt too still when the door opened again. My son stepped inside with a calm expression that didn't match the tension in his shoulders. His eyes swept over the bed, the monitor, the IV line, as if checking whether anything had changed without his permission. He tried to force a faint smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. He closed the door behind him with a controlled push, letting the soft click fill the quiet space between us. I didn't wait long. My voice came out steady, not loud. I asked him why he brought IV bags that didn't come from the hospital. I asked why a DNR had been submitted with a signature that wasn't mine. The questions landed one by one, simple and direct. His expression didn't break. He just exhaled slowly and moved toward the foot of the bed, as if he expected this conversation to end the same way every other difficult topic had, with me backing down. He said he had been helping. He said the decisions were complicated and he was trying to make them easier for everyone involved. His tone stayed soft, almost rehearsed, like someone delivering a line they practiced until it felt natural. He didn't deny anything outright. He just framed it as responsibility, as duty, as something any rational person would understand. His calmness felt colder than anger ever could. When he stepped closer to the IV pole, something in me tightened. His hand reached out as if to adjust the line, but before he could touch it, the door opened quietly. The security officer walked in first, followed by the lawyer. Neither raised their voices. They simply stepped between us with the kind of authority that didn't need explanation. My son froze, his hand still inches from the pole. The midnight nurse entered behind them, holding a folder. Her steps were steady, her posture straight. She stood at the side of the bed and opened the documents without looking at him. She laid out the forged DNR, the sedative report, and the timestamps from the footage. Her voice didn't waver as she read each item aloud. Every word landed with an impact that left no room for interpretation. She never accused him directly. She didn't have to. The facts spoke clearly. My son's jaw tightened as he listened, and for the first time, the calm expression cracked. He tried to shift the conversation back to intentions, to stress, to the idea that he had been managing things the best he could. The lawyer didn't engage. He simply closed the folder and signaled to the officer. It was the kind of gesture that confirmed the situation had crossed a line hours before my son walked into the room. My son turned toward the door, as if expecting to walk out without resistance, but the officer stepped in front of him, blocking the exit. There was no aggression, no raised voice, just a firm presence that made clear he wasn't leaving on his terms. My son glanced over his shoulder at me, eyes narrowing, frustration pushing through whatever composure he had left. For a moment, the room felt suspended in air. No movement, no sound. The nurse stood still with the folder. The lawyer waited with his hands clasped. The officer remained a barrier between my son and the door. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat, slow and heavy, as my son looked at each of them in turn. Then he leaned slightly toward me. His voice dropped to a whisper, quiet enough that only I could hear it, steady enough to feel deliberate. You were supposed to sleep through this. The room changed after my son was escorted out. The quiet was different now, less uncertain, more controlled. Within an hour, 2 officers arrived with clipboards and small voice recorders. They introduced themselves calmly, their tone steady, and began taking statements from the staff who had been present throughout the week. Each nurse spoke clearly, recounting what they saw without embellishment. The midnight nurse described the suspicious IV bag and the attempted DNR with a precision that left no gaps. I gave my account last, keeping my voice steady as I described the dizziness, the paperwork, the whispered warning, and the moment my son reached for the IV pole. The officers listened closely, asking short questions meant to clarify, not dramatize. After the statements were collected, the hospital lawyer returned with a new set of documents. He explained them carefully, laying each page on the tray in front of me. These forms gave the hospital full emergency authority over my medical decisions until further notice. They blocked any outside influence without written approval and ensured no one, not even family, could alter treatment without verification. The seriousness in his tone left no room for doubt. He had acted quickly because hesitation could have been dangerous. Later that afternoon, the officers returned to speak with the doctor on duty. I could hear parts of the conversation through the door, words like coercion, intent, and medical risk. My son was being questioned, not arrested, but the line between those two was thin. They asked about his behavior over the past week, the forged signature, and the timing of the sedative found in my blood. There was no shouting in the hallway, no scene, just the measured rhythm of a legal process beginning to take shape. The hospital took its own steps. By evening, a lock panel had been installed on my door, requiring a staff code to enter. A camera was added above the doorway, with a small green light that blinked steadily through the night. My chart was marked with a red alert symbol, indicating restricted access. Anyone attempting to modify it would need clearance from the head nurse. The procedural layers formed around me like quiet armor, protecting the spaces where my strength still hadn't fully returned. As the lights dimmed, the midnight nurse came in again. She pulled a chair close to the bed and checked the monitors with a calm hand. She didn't rush. When she finished, she rested her palm lightly on the rail and told me I was safe now, that the steps taken today would hold. Her voice stayed soft, but her certainty carried more comfort than anything I had felt in days. She didn't speak about the danger directly, only about the procedures that had been put in place. It was her way of offering closure without forcing me to relive the fear. Recovery didn't come fast. My body felt like it had been drained of weeks instead of days. Even sitting up took effort, but the dizziness had faded, and the heaviness behind my eyes no longer pushed me toward sleep. Nurses monitored my vitals closely, adjusting medications under direct supervision. Each time they entered the room, they moved with a kind of quiet caution, as if they knew the emotional weight was as heavy as the physical one. I spent long stretches of time staring at the ceiling, trying to understand how the lines between care and danger had blurred so easily. Betrayal doesn't arrive loudly. It arrives through small allowances, small trusts, small moments you don't question until they form a pattern you can't ignore. Moving through those thoughts was slow, but necessary. The room felt safer now, but the memory of the past days lingered in a way that wouldn't fade quickly. Near the end of the evening round, one of the officers returned. He stood at the foot of the bed, his expression firm but not unkind. He said the investigation was officially moving forward. Statements had been logged, evidence preserved, and interviews scheduled. It wasn't closure, not yet, but it was movement in the right direction. It was enough to breathe easier for the first time in days. The first time I sat up without anyone steadying my back, it felt strange, less like strength returning, and more like balance finding its place again. The room didn't tilt, and the floor didn't roll beneath me. I rested my hands on the rails, feeling the weight settle through my arms in a way that reminded me I was still here, still able to hold myself upright. It wasn't a victory. It was a quiet reminder that the worst had passed, and I was finally on the other side of it. The days had slowed down since the investigation began. The noise around me softened, and the staff moved with a calm that didn't feel forced. Sitting there, I let the silence stretch long enough to understand the shape of everything that had happened. Betrayal doesn't strike like lightning. It doesn't scream or demand attention. It grows quietly, hidden beneath gestures that look like help. A ride to the doctor, a hand arranging medications, a signature filled in just to save time. You don't feel the shift until dependence becomes something someone else can use. I had ignored too many small moments because they didn't look sharp enough to cut. I told myself things were harmless, that my son was overwhelmed, that letting him manage the paperwork was a kindness to both of us. But trust doesn't disappear in an instant. It thins over time, stretched by convenience, by weariness, by wanting peace more than clarity. I could see that now with a calmness that surprised me. The danger had never been my age. The danger had been believing I didn't need to question things simply because they came from someone close. A social worker came by with a stack of forms, and I reviewed them slowly, making sure every line reflected what I wanted. I revised my directives, updating who could make decisions and who couldn't. I listed every condition, every boundary, every requirement. I added my lawyer to the file, placed copies with the hospital, and made sure nothing could be changed without my signature. It felt less like protection and more like reclaiming ground I had given away without noticing. When she left, I sat in the quiet again and thought about the men I had known growing up, neighbors, uncles, friends of my father. They aged with a stubborn kind of pride, convinced that needing help meant losing authority. I understood now that the real danger wasn't needing help. The danger was handing it over blindly, not paying attention to who held the other end of the rope. Dependence is not a weakness by itself. It becomes dangerous only when someone sees it as an opening. I thought about the elders who sit in waiting rooms with folders they don't understand, trusting whoever drove them there. I thought about the ones who sign papers because a relative says it's just routine. I wished someone had said this plainly to me years ago. Document everything, read every line, and trust actions, not the tone of someone's voice, not the comfort of a familiar name, not the promise that someone is taking care of it. Care and control can look identical if you aren't watching closely. I felt no search for revenge inside me, no hunger for dramatic justice. Survival had its own kind of peace, quiet, steady, earned. The investigation would continue without me needing to hold it up. My job now was making sure I didn't step back into the same shadows that allowed this to happen. I breathed slowly, letting my spine settle against the pillows, letting the truth sit without bitterness. In the stillness of that room, with the door locked for safety and the monitors tracing their slow, steady rhythms, one final thought settled clearly, without anger or fear. Growing old isn't the danger. Trusting blindly is.